my name is Hannah Mail, and this video and the one after it are going to talk about the growth of the tourism industry to Egypt, largely from the Western side of things and the larger social and political currents that tourism industry exposes. And the way that I'm going to do this is I have taken excerpts from Western or mostly Westerners who went to Egypt from roughly 1600s through the 19th century. And after a little overview of kind of the period, I'm going to read those excerpts to you. This video is going to be on the long side as well as the one after it because I've compiled a fair amount of material, and it has two main purposes, which is to get the word out about just the variety of tourist accounts to Egypt that are out there and where they can be accessed and how they can be accessed, but also, like my videos in the past on this channel, I'm doing my best to fundraise for the Egyptology Master's program at IU Bloomington that I'm in now. So mostly I'm going to do that through promoting my GoFundMe campaign. So if you see this video or the next one after, or if you watch part of this video, that link to that GoFundMe will be in the description box. And if you feel inspired to donate, that would be wonderful. If not, then I hope you at least leave after watching this, even if you don't do the whole thing, because as I said, this video and the next one is going to be on the longer side, that you leave with at least kind of a greater understanding of the growth of the tourism industry in Egypt and kind of what it's entangled and messed up with. So, as at least from the scholarly literature that I've read, I've kind of figured out, or at least divided, the history of tourism in Egypt into three broad periods. So we have the kind of first period of late antiquity through Greco-Roman period. So this is when Egypt is under first the rule of the Ptolemaic dynasty, which establishes itself in Egypt in the wake of Alexander the Great's death. And then later on, when Egypt is conquered by Rome and is basically a province of the Roman Empire. So in this period, we have different Greco-Roman people coming to Egypt as what we would call tourists to see these different sites. So to see tombs in the valleys of the kings or queens, to see the statues of Memnon, and a fair amount of these tourists, or at the very least some of them, left etchings or inscriptions or graffiti on the monuments as they saw as basically a record that they were there. And then you have the period of time when Egypt is under Muslim rule, starting from roughly the 600s CE. And we have a rich body of Muslim scholarship on the history of Egypt and on the state of all these monuments from ancient Egypt as well. So there's, I forget the full title, but it's by a Muslim scholar that is a history of the pyramids at Giza. So basically a record and kind of a compilation of what the Muslim community at that time thought about the history of the Giza pyramids, but also their appearance, at the time of writing. And then we have the kind of third stage that is still largely going on, that we're more familiar with, which is where the West kind of gets into the the entrance of the Western tourist into Egypt. So this starts roughly in the 1600s ish and goes through, or at least it's still kind of forming, and developments are happening through the 19th century, and of course it's still going strong to today. So most of the excerpts that I'm going to be reading from come from Western tourists from this 1600-ish period on, and then I do have one or two Muslim accounts from earlier on. So this is from the site of Elephantine, and which is a island that has multiple pharaonic remains. And this is just one of those buildings, but it's a Greek inscription. So either a Greek person that permanently lived in Egypt, and maybe lived in Elephantine, one day saw this monument and kind of, wrote this inscription, or the Greek person was visiting Egypt. I don't know what it says in particular because I don't know Greek, but it kind of speaks to the wider presence of Greeks in Egypt wanting to kind of leave their permanent mark on things that they may have encountered. So these are just some key dates. And we have the Western Roman Empire that falls in the 400s CE. The AD is here because that was the older way to say these dates, and I thought I changed all my slides to some more current scholarly CE, but I guess I missed some. And so in the roughly from the 400 CE to the 500 CE, Egypt is actually technically under the control of the Eastern Roman, which becomes the Byzantine Empire, and it's under Christian rule and Christian control, and so that's where we get this period of Coptic Egypt. And then 641 is when Islamic forces come in, and they're able to successfully oust the political control of the Byzantine Empire. And so that, of course, means that Muslim rule and Muslim law rather than Christian rule and law is now over Egypt. It's not until the 900s CE that you actually have the creation of basically the first part of what is now modern Cairo. So it takes basically like once the Islamic forces have a secure hold, that is when they start to build up what becomes Cairo. So from 642 to 1517 CE, Egypt is basically under the rule of different Islamic caliphates and dynasties, because which Muslim forces politically control Egypt at particular times is partly dependent on the kind of wider political developments and dynastic struggles in the wider Islamic world. And I'm not an Islamic scholar, so I don't know the details of that period. By the time you get to the early 1500s, so 1517-ish, you start to have the rise in what we now know as the Middle East, and basically right kind of to the edge of Europe, of the Islamic Ottoman Empire. And from roughly 1517 to basically the 19th century, that is who technically controls Egypt and rules Egypt as the political authority, is the Ottoman Empire. So Egypt is a province of the Ottoman Empire, like it was a province of the Roman Empire, before that. And the Ottoman Empire is the dominant, or remains the dominant Islamic empire that Europe kind of has the most direct dealings with, politically and commercially, for most of what we call the early modern European period. So 1500s to about 1900s, which is where a lot of the accounts I'm going to be drawing from come from as well. Then in 1798, we have Napoleon's military invasion of Egypt. And that military invasion, or his invasion, which has two prongs. So it has the military side that has the larger context of imperialistic struggles and control against British Empire, and attempting to kind of cut their access off from India through Egypt. But it also has a scholarly side, because part of Napoleon's vision is that France will take Egypt as a colony, and then using that kind of white man's burden rhetoric, bring the Egyptian people fully into civilization. So part of that process is Napoleon doesn't only bring soldiers with him on his Egyptian campaign, but he brings hundreds, and I might have even been thousands, but it's definitely hundreds of what he calls savants, or which are scholars of the time, to record and draw everything that they saw of Egypt's ancient past. So both the monuments that they saw, and then the topography that was existing at the time. And the military part of his invasion ends up going really badly. The British kind of eventually come out on top. And so what ends up being the lasting, or the most lasting and most impactful part of his invasion, is the scholarly side of things, because the savants that are with him and that kind of follow the army and do their drawings and their etchings, they produce hundreds of drawings, and they also find a fair amount of objects. And so what ultimately comes out of Napoleon's invasion is multiple volumes of a scholarly publication that's produced using the resources of the state, called the Description de l'Egypte. And this comes out in multiple volumes, because there's full color as well as black and white plates, throughout basically I think it's 1810s, or I think mostly it's the 1820s, because it takes a while to finish producing each volume. As I said, when the French invaded, Egypt was technically still a province of, Egypt was a province of the Ottoman Empire. And I forget if the Ottomans sent this gentleman to Egypt to kind of fight against Napoleon, or if he was already there as basically the kind of local political authority that answered to the Ottomans for like the Egyptian territory. But basically you have Muhammad Ali that somehow gains, or already has, political control of the area. And so in the wake of the French defeat and the French exodus of troops, Muhammad Ali essentially becomes the unofficial ruler of Egypt, and then later his heirs, because he does end up founding a dynasty, are the ones that hold power for basically much of the 19th century. Formal British occupation, so where they actually send troops in, is from 1882 to 1922, and it's not until 1953 that Egypt actually gets its full independence back. So the main point of the dates that I've just summarized is to highlight how deeply and just how entwined those larger processes of imperialism and empire building, and all that stuff was with the growth of the discipline of Egyptology, because the discipline of Egyptology as a discipline in the West is usually dated to basically Napoleon's military campaign and after. And so you have a lot of these foundational Egyptology ideas and Egyptologists that live and are working and are thinking about things and coming up with all these theories, as the heyday of scientific racism and empire building, for Britain and France and Germany is also going on. And just to sort of highlight that and emphasize, if you read the travel accounts, even excerpts of them, a lot of that comes through. So I will be saying words and using vocabulary that is offensive because it's part of this cultural mix at the time, and it's negative in a sense because it's, that there is that hierarchy and people kind of place themselves above or below others, but at the same time, the fact that we can read these works does give us a window into the beliefs of the time. So part of the sort of larger 19th century political Western, but activities in Egypt were basically to decide who should get political ownership and political control of Egypt. And a lot of this takes place, and kind of a lot of that is fought through during roughly the first half of the 19th century, so the 1800s. So the three main imperial contenders that sort of emerge post-Napoleonic campaign are Germany, Britain, and France. By the 1810s, Britain and France are kind of the main ones that are left still standing, and so 1830-ish, it's still really up in the air as to which of those nations will do its best to enfold Egypt into its empire and have political and social control over it. And by 1848-ish, it's kind of clear, or at least the sort of writings on the wall, that England and the kind of larger British Empire are going to win that, at least from the political side. And the sort of gentleman's bargain that the two empires come to is, okay, we've kind of won control of the political side, but we'll let the French stay in control of kind of the antiquity side and cultural antiquities. So that's why a few slides back, I said that Egypt wasn't fully independent until the 1950s, because it's only in 1953 that they get a antiquities minister at the head of the antiquities service that's actually Egyptian. And part of the reason they get that is because they take full control back of the Suez Canal and kick out the British, and I think there were some American troops in there as well. In the 1850s is when you get the first railway route in Egypt and all the impacts that that has on the tourism industry. Also in the 1850s, you have the construction of the Suez Canal. And then 1869 is when the Suez Canal is actually finished. Also in the 1860s, you have Thomas Cook, who has a kind of a local traveling company in Egypt, and he takes his first group of tourists to Egypt under the umbrella of his travel company. And it's wildly successful, and that sort of starts a flood of a new economic, more middle class Victorian traveler to Egypt, using elements of Thomas Cook's company. In the 1880s, so particularly 1882, is when British occupation officially begins. So that is when, partly because of some things that happen in Alexandria, which is a term, a revolt or a rebellion in British print and media of the time, they actually send troops into Egypt, and those troops then are stayed and actually based in Egypt. So that's why the official British occupation is usually put down to that 1882. By the 1890s, you have a growing movement both against Egyptians and from Westerners that British should not be occupying or controlling Egypt. And then by the 19 teens, you have a formal independence movement in Egypt. And partly kind of as a result of larger things and larger geopolitical things that happened in the wake of the end of World War I, you have in 1922, Egypt is declared formally independent, and it's formally declared a kingdom, and the political authority at the time, Sultan Fuad, is proclaimed king of Egypt. And then, as I said, it's not until the 50s that Egypt takes full control of the Suez Canal, and Dr. Zahi Hawass becomes the first Egyptian head of the Antiquity Service. Dr. Zahi Hawass is a controversial character in the wake of Mubarak's in the wake of the 2011 revolution and Mubarak's fall. Dr. Zahi Hawass lost his position. He still does things in Egyptology, but he is a controversial character. But it's even after he lost his position now, each head of the Antiquities service is an Egyptian. So now I'm going to get into some of the assumptions that I found in travel accounts that just seem to crop up over and over, whether it was an American writing or a German or a English person or someone somewhere else from Egypt. Just these assumptions that, of course, this is how it is. That kind of they seem to have had. So this is where we're going to get into that offensive and problematic language and vocabulary. And so you'll notice that in these slides, for some of the words, I've put air quotes, and I'm going to be using that in the kind of hand language as well, because this is vocabulary that is found in these texts. And these are categories or things that just kind of seem to have assumed to be existing. So one of the very basic assumptions that I found running through almost all of these accounts is that there is such a thing as different distinct biological races. And you can see those in Egypt, and depending on which race you're talking about, you know, good or kind of or bad characteristics emerge. Connected with that, there is this idea that civilization is basically linear and that it kind of develops one way and evolves from like lower to higher. And depending on what race you're talking about, it kind of it fits into different parts of the civilizational rung. So this is again very different from how we look at things now, but this is language, and this is a definite assumption that's just kind of embedded through a lot of these accounts. Connected with that, there's an assumption, or at least an argument that's made by a lot of these travelers, that the pharaonic Egyptians, basically the people who lived and worked at all these monuments that they're seeing, were somehow better or superior to later Muslim rule, and Muslim rule has made the country worse somehow. So this is kind of a common topos, because for roughly 1600s through 1700s, when you entered Egypt, either as a tourist or just for business, you entered Alexandria first, and then you if you wanted to go on to Cairo, you did that later on. And so this topos of the Muslim rule has kind of degenerated things comes in right away for a lot of these travelers when they talk about Alexandria, and they kind of paint this picture of antique or ancient Alexandria under the Ptolemies being this bastion of culture and just great things, and now the monuments are ruined and the current rule is not adequately caring for them, and so on and so on. So right from their entrance into Egypt, you kind of already see those hierarchies that they just kind of have in their mind as this is the way the world works, already coming into play. Connected, not necessarily with that thread, but with the larger thread of empire building, you have an argument made by European and like American guidebooks that there is, and again, word that we would not use now because has very problematical issues and baggage, but a word that appears over and over in the travel accounts, which is natives. And that is how, in large part, the people who are living in Egypt, when these travel accounts are written, as how they're largely described. And there is like very patronizing that, like they can do good things, and they can, advance, but it's sometimes it's implied, sometimes it's outright stated, the superior British or German or French or American person has to adopt a certain tone, and presence of authority and manner to, bring those qualities out. And something else that, I not a lot of the excerpts speak to this thread in particular, but again, if you really dive down the full rabbit hole of travel accounts, you will definitely encounter it. And it's it's still a somewhat a live wire question, to kind of the history of ancient Egypt today. So, did the original Egyptians come from Asia or Africa? I.e., what was the race of the original Egyptians? So were they white or black? And the terminology that you'll see in a lot of the accounts to kind of cover this is, were the original Egyptians Semitic or Asiatic? And it's that, again, those racial hierarchies, and really laser focus on the skin tone, and that was a big question that they just was very important to solve. And different things like the original decoration of the Sphinx, things that Herodotus said, things like that are used to weigh in, especially for a lot of the 19th century, because that's when you have the heyday of scientific racism and racial classification and biology, that really starts to become embedded. You see that in the literature. So these are just some images that kind of speak to those larger currents. So this is from 1799, and it's a British political cartoon. So it's basically, making fun of Napoleon's military losses, in Egypt. And then, this is a lithograph, so basically an early form of drawing from 1840. I picked it because of its title. So it's titled The Egyptian Beauty. And this speaks to something else that you'll notice in the travel accounts, which is that very early on, Egyptian women are sexualized and orientalized in the eyes of Western travelers. And so there's kind of this dichotomy that springs up. And so that is the sort of larger cultural context that this caption in particular, is speaking to. And then this is from 1879. So it's in the category of political cartoons, but I think it was originally found in a textbook type publication about Egypt from 1886. And what it shows is an Egyptian woman asking for back sheesh, or basically, tips. And this is something else that, a lot of the Westerners in their accounts will say, is that the Egyptians are constantly asking for back bakshish, and you need to be firm and only give them, the amount of bakshish and basically the amount of tips that, their work warrants. And so again, it's the sort of larger context of how racial hierarchies were at that point, and what the Europeans said Egyptian culture was like, is sort of reflected in this image. Then this is from it's from 1880. So by then, of course, you had early photography as a technology that was developed. And of course, for basically all of the period that I'm going to be talking about, it was still possible to climb the Great Pyramid or any other structures in Egypt. And so another sort of topos that you'll see, especially in a lot of the 19th century accounts, is what their experience was of climbing one of the pyramids at Giza. Usually, it's the Great Pyramid, and this is a photo by the Zangi brothers, who were particularly famous particularly well-known set of photographers for the kind of tourism industry and trade in Egypt. And I think they were originally from Greece. And then these last two images are from the same source. So they are actually from a family photo album. So the Von Hollowell family. And what they've done is, I don't know the details, but somehow either a member of the family or basically the photo albums have been released via wiki images into the public domain. So looking at these images, just keep that in mind, that these are all people who lived and were doing stuff in 1901. But part of the reason that I chose them is that they are a larger product, and kind of what they did in Egypt is a larger outgrowth of the power that the British Empire at that time had over Egypt. And what this image in particular is they are on their diaba, which is basically the kind of main type of boat that the Western traveler, particularly if they were more of the wealthy side, used to go up and down the Nile to visit the different sites in Egypt. And here they, are having a nice family breakfast as they see the sights of the Nile. The fact that I think it's a Dutch family, but that's basically not from what we would think of as the kind of dominant European countries. So not England, not Germany, not France, not America, speaks to the international cast and just the major jump in tourism in the West in Egypt by that 1901 date. This is, like I said, from that same album. And I picked this one in particular because it shows a male member of the family with some sort of fowl that he has hunted and is now kind of holding up as a prize. And that is something that you'll come across in a lot of these accounts, is advice, of where you can hunt, what you should bring, and sort of embedded within that is that assumption that Westerners at that time had of ownership over not just Egypt, but over its monuments and over even the animals that were living in Egypt. So again, this is a family that was on vacation, but at the same time, it speaks to the larger assumption of ownership that so many Westerners had when they were in Egypt at this time. So, in terms of where you can get these accounts, most of them are in the public domain because they've been written long enough in the past that there's no longer copyright on them. So, in terms of online, the sources that I've used the most are the Library of Congress digital collection, the Internet Archive, and then the New York Public Library digital collection. I've also used a site called Merit Sager Books. So this is, So this is actually a site that you can, if you wish, order in print books. But what the site also has, and this is what I've used, is e-books. So these are books that are print books, and the owner of this shop and site has scanned them and put them in PDF form, and you can read them online or download the PDF. So this is where I've gotten a lot of my accounts that come from prior to 1700. And then if you want to hold the actual physical copy of a book in your hands, I have used online bookstore sites mainly. So I've mainly used Abe Books, but I've used Thrift Books a few times as well. And part of that is especially for Abe Books. There's like publishing companies that they favor, that their whole thing is to put out of print books that are in the public domain into these physical copies of books. So that's one reason why I kind of favor Abe Books more. So now I'm going to go over some of the formatting things for accounts prior to 1700-ish, because there's definite ways that they were formatted, and that the typefaces, that if you're reading it or looking at it for the first time, you might go like, how do I navigate this? So the first thing that you'll notice is that for a lot of the accounts prior to 1700, they have really long titles. It seems like their goal is like in the title, like do a summary, like everything that they're going to talk about in the book. So this is from Merit Sager Books, so from one of their e-books. And this is the title page. So the title starts here, and I think it goes all the way down there. And then it gives the author and where this particular edition is printed. And so for a lot of the titles that I've annotated, you'll see the ... which is me signifying that the title goes on beyond that. It would basically take up the whole slide if I did the full fractal. This is from Pocock's, or one of the title pages from Pocock's works on Egypt, and I've got this one from the Internet Archive. But what I want to draw your attention to is this is part of the dedication page. And the dedication is to a member of the English nobility. And so right away, right from the inception of Egyptology and the inception of the tourism industry, those those patronage networks were already in place and were already kind of part of the package with all the attendant empire building and kind of larger themes that are behind those. So that's just something else that I kind of wanted to point out. This is now going to a little bit of the sort of formatting quirks that you'll see in a lot of these pre-1700-ish accounts, which is that you basically have at the very end of the page, and I don't know for sure why this is. My guess is it's a mix of structurally with the way the typing machines worked, that they had to do this, and then maybe it just became kind of conventional later on. But I don't know that for sure. So if anyone is a historian of printing presses of this period, they might have a better idea of the particulars of why you see this. But basically what they do is at the very bottom of the page, they have the first word of the next page. And so when you're first looking at it, it looks like you read it more acceptable to the generality of readers when. And then you go on to the next page and you read when he was blah, 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 blah. But what you actually do is more acceptable to the generality of readers. You don't read that very last word that's at the bottom of the page. And then when you turn the page, you start at that very first word. So you go, because in this case, this is the very next page after this page. One of the other things that you see again in the formatting is that the F's are sometimes S's. So that's why I picked out these images here. This is again from one of Pocock's works. And so this looks like Moth Quay of St. Anna Thyasis, but actually those are S's. So it's Mosque of St. Athen or Athen A.S. And so that's just kind of something that if you read a sentence and you first read it as one of the two and you're that doesn't quite make sense, go back and read it as the other one, and that might be where your issue is. So that's just something to be aware of, again, that they do for formatting as you're going through these accounts that you see mostly accounts prior to 1700-ish. This is something else, again, that is formatting in those accounts. So this is basically the kind of way that they wrote their accounts back then, is they put the footnotes at the bottom basically, and sometimes to the frame of the side here, and then they put that last word that you're not supposed to read, even though it looks like you are, but you are supposed to read on the next page after those footnotes. So here you have the remains of that superb, and then you can read the footnotes, and then you can turn the page, and then the word that you start with reading on the next page is building. Or it's, yeah, so in this case, it's the end of the sentence. And that is also from Pocock's work. So the way that I've organized the excerpts is through basically a lot of the questions and a lot of the concerns that modern tourists have. So how can you actually get to the place, in this case, Egypt? Once you get there, where do you actually first land? What do you bring with you? And what monuments can you see, and kind of how can you see them? And so through those larger themes, you'll see those greater themes of empire building, and the negative isms of the day emerge. And also from here on, unless it's otherwise stated on the slide, the page numbers are the original manuscript pages, because sometimes when they've been scanned and converted into modern PDFs, the PDF page doesn't always match up with the original manuscript page. So I think I'm going to do one excerpt, and then I'm going to end this video and do part 2 after. So the first text that I chose is the Oriental Geography of Ibn Khaldun, so one of the Muslim scholars. So he lived in Egypt during the 900 CE, but his work was originally in Arabic. So the version that I'm getting it from is an English translation from 1800 that I found at the Library of Congress. And that speaks to the larger issue of a lot of these Islamic and Muslim sources have been read by non-Arabic speakers and non-native speakers of the language. So there's been mistranslations and nuances and things like that have been lost. And in this, in the discussion box for this video, and then for the other ones, I'll also put some secondary sources that speak to this larger history, if you want to take a deeper dive. So one of the boundaries of Egypt begins from the Sea of Rum between Alexandria, and Barca at the deserts behind Wa, proceeding to the land of the Nubians and to the land of Bia, and back from Aswan to the Sea of Rome, or to the Sea of Rum, and from Biha to the Sea of Kolzum, the Red Sea, till it comes to the Tor Sinai, Mount Sinai, in the territories of the children of Israel. And like I said, I'm going to stop part 1 there. Tune back in for part 2 and probably part 3, where I read more excerpts of accounts from roughly the 1600s until 1902, I think is my last one either comes from 1901 or 1902. And a little teaser, part 2 will start with an account from the 1600s, so a Western account. Bye.